At the end of 2023, the excitement among libertarians was great. Javier Milei, a self-proclaimed libertarian and anarcho-capitalist, became president of Argentina. Argentina, over 100 years ago one of the wealthiest countries in the world, has been plagued for decades by corruption, inflation, military coups, and social democracy. Between Peronists, who represent a particularly state-oriented alliance from left to right, and Kirchnerists, who also see themselves as state-oriented but who are progressive leftists, there were only brief pauses for relaxation for the market, as in the 1990s under Menem, who was something like a neoliberal, even as a Peronist, who therefore broke with traditional Peronism, and Macri, who was more of a conservative and pro-market economy guy in 2015 to 2019, before Fernandez again fueled inflation during the COVID-19 pandemic. Everything should be different under Javier Milei. Javier Milei told the world for the first time things many had never heard of. In front of every camera, he explained how he would abolish the ministries.
Ministerio de Turismo y Deporte, afuera. Ministerio de Cultura, afuera. Ministerio de Ambiente y Desarrollo Sostenible, afuera. Ministerio de las Mujeres y Género y Diversidad, afuera. Ministerio de Obras Públicas, afuera, aunque te resistas.
He explained how he would close down the central bank.
I wanted to ask you first on what most raises doubts among investors, which is the dollarization plan. How fast do you think it can be implemented? How is it going to work in practice? And how will you get the Congress to approve it?
I think there's a previous discussion about dollarization. Actually, strictly speaking, it's to get rid of the central bank. The dollarization is an instrumental issue at the end of the day. There are four argumentative axes. One has to do with a moral issue, which is that stealing is wrong, and seigniorage is nothing more or less than a swindle by politicians against good people. Therefore, let's say if we consider that stealing is wrong, one of the greatest thieves in the history of mankind is the central bank. The second point has to do with a technical issue, because in the Argentine case, it is more evident when a product has no demand, its price is zero. So, if the local currency has no demand, and its price should be zero, the equilibrium real balances are zero. Whatever amount of money a central bank wishes to impose, the counterpart is that the price level is infinite. Demand and its price should be zero. Equilibrium real balances are zero. Whatever amount of money a central bank wants to impose, the flip side is that the price level has infinity.
And what do you do with the central bank? Would you close it? At one point you made the joke that you were going to set it on fire.
Well, what you do with the building is a problem of what you decide to do with it. It's a figure, it's a metaphor. What I'm saying is that the institution doesn't exist anymore. I am saying that in the transition, until you can transform the banking system into a free banking system, it will have to fulfill the function of regulating the banks. The superintendent of financial institutions will continue to operate until a free banking system can be set up.
And in that idea, if you are president in 6 months, 10 months, 1 year, all the bills in circulation in Argentina would be dollars?
All dollars, yes.
And he showed himself posing with the chainsaw as a symbol of how he would cut down the state. He constantly quoted names that were only familiar to people in the libertarian spectrum: Ludwig von Mises, Frederick Bastiat, Henry Hazlitt, Murray Rothbard, Hans-Hermann Hoppe. There was so far only one politician who had so generously embraced libertarianism, and that was the American Congressman Ron Paul.
The recently elected president of Argentina, Javier Milei.
Yeah.
He's been a pretty persuasive communicator. Now, I know there's some questions about what his foreign policy will look like, but he's got the charisma, and he's talking about von Mises and Bastiat on their TV, just like you, and yet he's president. So a lot of people have compared him in some ways to some of your ideas about economic liberty. What do you think of what he's done so far?
Well, I think it's an example of what we said a few minutes ago, that ideas can't be stopped even by armies.
Right.
So, they exist. They may have to go people underground. So it's exciting when you have somebody like that comes up front, but he'll have a struggle. And even from both sides, the purists on the libertarian side, well, he missed out on this. But if there's up for discussion, if you're moving in the right direction, that is very good.
Yeah.
And you have to keep the effort to know which direction you're going in. You can't balance the budget by saying, oh, we need this as an emergency because next year we have this war to fight, that sort of thing. You have to go in the right direction, and that is always toward liberty. And it will be a struggle, but it's still exciting.
What Ron Paul warned about as early as March 2024, that you also have to implement what you promise, seems to have gone up in smoke halfway through Javier Milei's term of office and the parliamentary elections. As Samuel Edward Konkin already explained to the era of Ronald Reagan, they all are libertarians now. Everyone calls himself a libertarian. Under the concept of libertarianism, Reagan had already expanded the budget and intervened in foreign policy. But in 2025, Mark Zuckerberg calls himself a libertarian. Slavoj Žižek calls Donald Trump a libertarian fascist. A YouTuber goes so far as to call Stalin and Mao libertarians. Since obviously everyone can call themselves libertarian or get this attribute by others, it seems as if words no longer mean anything, and we should focus a little more on real actions by the words of Ron Paul. If we want to take the term libertarian seriously and understand it as opposed to socialist, it means no more and no less than privatization instead of nationalization. For this purpose, it is worth dividing politics into two areas, domestic and foreign policy. Let's start with domestic politics. Milei himself said the libertarian slogan "taxation is theft" dozens of times, and yet he admitted that although he had reduced some taxes, he had increased others elsewhere. Regulations were lowered in some places, which in part actually provided more housing, while elsewhere exchange rates were fixed instead of Argentinians being able to change their pesos to US dollars and the cheaper black market rate. And export tariffs, such as those on soybeans, Javier Milei did not get rid of until after he was granted a $20 billion loan from the United States, pushing Donald Trump out of a deal with China. But the biggest dispute is obviously the abolition of the Argentine central bank Becerra. Milei's success in fighting and restricting inflation continues to be echoed all over the media, but here again a common problem of term definitions arises. What exactly is inflation? In the modern view, inflation refers to the general price increase, measured by baskets of goods that the government calculates and issues in statistics. However, the original meaning of inflation is not to increase, but to inflate. Not like stairs, but like a balloon. Inflation actually means the expansion of the money supply by the central bank, and this is the point to which economists of the Austrian school, meaning the school to which Javier Milei claims to belong, refers. When it comes to inflation, Austrians talk about the cause, while conventional, meaning Keynesian, economists refer to the effect. In contrast to statistics about baskets of goods, where there is quite a lot of room for manipulation, the figures for expanding the money supply are relatively unambiguous. The money supply under Milei has almost quadrupled, which is roughly in line with Fernandez's policies during the pandemic and definitely higher than under President Macri in the 90s. In terms of numbers, Saifedean Ammous, the author of the Bitcoin Standard, has dealt with this very well, but there are several problems. The economic layman will make the work easy for himself and simply ask ChatGPT, Grok, or another AI of his choice what an accurate comparison of the money supply expansion under Milei and, for example, under Fernandez looks like only to be presented with the result that Milei has inherited a large part of the inflation, whereupon he has dramatically lowered it. But the economic layman imagines a comparison between Milei and Fernandes as if he were observing two different people gaining weight. Fernandes, let's say, has gained 150 pounds in 4 years, while Javier Milei has gained 80 pounds in not quite 2 years, let's say. Whereby the estimates for 4 years come out at about 110 pounds. Then you come to the conclusion that Milei is better than Fernandes. Even in this quite nonsensical calculation alone, you can immediately see that it refers to vague forecasts in order to make the data comparable. But what is also omitted is that we are dealing with the same economy. No one denies that Milei inherited hyperinflation from Fernandes, but now it is not only his job to reduce his own inflation, but also that of his predecessors. Politicians and the media often try to deceive the population with cooked numbers by explaining that it is positive news that inflation has fallen, but realistically, the expansion of the money supply has only been reduced a little, but the process itself has not been reversed, which would be necessary. I mean, if I gain 20 pounds in 2023, another 22 pounds in 2024, and then I only gain 10 pounds in 2025, then I can easily claim that I have reduced my weight gain by 50%. But this is still a harmful process for both my body and the economy in that metaphor. And this is where another crucial point comes to play, namely the different schools of economic thought. In principle, we distinguish 4 of them: Marxism, Keynesianism, monetarism, also known as Chicago School, and the Austrian School. And since Milei declares himself to be a follower of the Austrian School, we must also take Milei at his word and focus on the statements of the largest think tank of the Austrian School, the Mises Institute. In September 2025, the Mises Institute of Germany announced that it wanted to award the Memorial Prize to Javier Milei, after which 3 members of the executive board, consisting of Hans-Hermann Hoppe, Jörg Guido Hülsmann and Rolf Puster, resigned. They published a statement that I copied from Stefan Kinsella's page and translated it to German, whereupon I drew the attention of Oskar Grau, who had been criticizing Milei since he took office, but whose criticism received little to no attention. Hans-Hermann Hoppe is considered one of the biggest stars of the libertarian spectrum and the Austrian school. His controversial book, Democracy, the God That Failed, has earned him worldwide fame, while he himself considers his contribution to argumentation ethics to be most valuable, which was recognized by his mentor Murray Rothbard, as well as by other authors such as Walter Block and Stefan Kinsella. And with this concept, property rights, the axiom of action of Mises, the natural law of Rothbard, and thus the transition from the actual to the target state was justified purely theoretically. Hoppe's doctor thesis, Critique of Causal Scientific Social Research from 1983, I myself recently translated from German into English and made it available to the Mises Institute and to Stefan Kinsella. Jörg Guido Hülsmann is also considered one of the most important representatives of the Austrian school among the Americans, and Hülsmann has criticized both forced democracy and inflation in many of his works. And we don't have to stop here. Almost all representatives of the Austrian school reject central banks and advocate a deflationary currency. The theory behind this is simple to understand. If the money supply remains the same, but production increases, prices must fall. And that is good for all consumers, so everyone. The opposite view, meaning the common doctrines at universities, politics, and the media, is that the money supply must also expand with increasing production. Because, the explanations vary and you get hours of explanations for this, but none of them is particularly meaningful or understandable. In the Human Action podcast, Jonathan Newman recently explains to Ryan McMacken why an elastic money supply has never made any sense. And at Mises University 2025, Paul Sivek explains in his lecture on business cycles that monetary expansion by the central bank leads to economic malinvestment, which must be reversed, making a recession inevitable. Milei and his cabinet, which he and his sister, who has been involved in multiple fraud scandals, have chosen, consisting of corrupt Keynesians such as Federico Sturzenegger, Luis Caputo, and Santiago Bausili, are now using a rather simple trick in the media. Instead of examining savings based on current assets and checking accounts in terms of money supply, Keynesians equate income with expenditure and divide it into income-dependent consumer spending and non-income-dependent investment and government spending. For some reason, shocks happen that are never predicted but are only recognized once they have occurred, resulting in a lack of investment which the government has to compensate for.
You'll notice that only one of the components of the expenditure has a slope, and that's the consumption function there at the bottom. The consumption function is the only one that has a slope, and it's totally dependent on income. So you add the intercept is autonomous consumption, and you have income multiplied by what's called the marginal propensity to consume, which turns out to be the only variable that goes into determining the Keynesian spending multipliers, which you've heard a lot about, I'm sure. And then you stack on investment spending, which isn't dependent on income, importantly, and government spending, which also is not dependent on income. Notice the slope of that investment spending line and the government spending line is totally dependent on the consumption function. So you just sort of stack it on top. In my classes, I like to refer to it as a stack of pancakes. You've got a stack of consumption pancakes, a stack of investment spending pancakes, and a stack of terrible tasting government spending pancakes. Okay, so the reason I talk about the stack of pancakes is because it makes it easier for students to think about taking some of those pancakes out. So if we start taking away some spending, and in the Keynesian model, what's typically done is we say there's this unanticipated decrease in investment spending. So you see that investment spending line? What I'm about to do when I click the button here is it's going to fall, but you'll notice that the top line falls down at the same rate. It does the same exact thing. So, and that's because what we're going to stipulate is that there is no response from the government. There's no government policy that steps in and says we're going to change the way we're spending because of the change in investment spending. So watch what happens when we have an unanticipated decrease in investment spending.
The Milei government claims that it has frozen the money supply, but what it actually did is simply using a Keynesian trick in which it merely looks at a model that involves government spending that can be varied. For economists of the Austrian school, this is a pretty easily detectable fraud, even if this practice is also applied at the Federal Reserve or the European Central Bank. In order not to make a complete economic presentation from this video, I want to conclude the two crucial points that follow from this. First, this entire model of government spending, consumption stimulation, fiscal policy, and monetary expansion by the central bank is due to the fractional reserve system, which does not mean much more than that banks are allowed to spend more money than they actually have. Gold in their vaults out of tradition. This fractional reserve system is the key point of "End the Fed" from Ron Paul and represents nothing more than legalized counterfeiting. And point two, if all this is so clear, at least for economists of the Austrian school, how is it that apart from Saifedean Ammous, Oskar Grau and Christopher Hansen, pretty much no one from the Mises Institute rushes to this fraud to expose it? The reason for this has a single name, and that is Philipp Bargus. Philipp Bargus enjoys an excellent reputation among libertarians and representatives of the Austrian school, and by no means unjustifiably so. In his article The Quality of the Money, Bargus describes reasons for the lack of investment, such as inflation expectations. He often described the benefits of deflation in different articles and lectures, and he also emphasizes the importance of decentralization for a prosperous economy. But while the Milei government is clearly again acting against all of these recommendations of the Austrian school, Philipp Bargus vehemently defends Milei. When I drew his attention on X to the fact that his only article in defense of Milei contained large explanatory gaps which Oskar Grau had already denounced, he posted an article from 2016 which he had published at the University of Munich together with David Howden by also speaking out against a fractional reserve system. And at this point, I don't get any further. If this is some kind of complicated 4D chess that Milei with Bargus' academic backing should first reschedule debt with the help of the IMF and the US with billions of dollars, and then at some point in the future trigger the dollarization of Argentina again, I do not understand the plan. Javier Milei defies criticism anyway and prefers to make fun of Hoppe's alleged ignorance of economics on a talk show, while his knowledge of the Austrian school is very superficial for someone who claims to have read Human Action at least 10 times. Defenders of Milei, especially those who are fluent in Spanish, are really welcome to explain to me how often Milei talks about time preference, which is the basis for interest rates in the Austrian School of Economics, as we can see from Jeffrey Herbener's lecture. I could not find a conversation from Keith Knight in which he talks about Argentina. Tom Wood's last podcast on Argentina and the benefits of Milei's politics was 9 months ago. The only conversation about the plan for the dollarization of Argentina with Bob Murphy hardly included a lively exchange of pros and cons, but only dealt with the settlement. Ryan McMacken once interviewed Christopher Hansen on Radio Rothbard and stated that Milei has neither abolished the central bank nor carried out the dollarization, which he called quite a bummer. Perhaps I am overlooking something crucial, but I am increasingly suspecting that economists of the Austrian school seem to be just as corruptible by politicians as doctors and medical scientists during the COVID pandemic. Of course, I am familiar with the motive that economists enjoy the hype surrounding Milei so that they too receive some attention. I mean, Stefan Ring, one of the initiators of the German Mises Institute, has just published a book about Milei's successes. But Saifedean Ammous has already warned that we, meaning real libertarians, will soon have to face the accusation that Milei's policies are bound to fail just like those of any other Keynesian social democrat, and that we will then be ridiculed for proclaiming that this was not true libertarianism, just as we are now doing it to the communists. Isn't that exactly a huge opportunity to face while Milei is still in office and not doing anything he originally promised? Shouldn't the Mises Institute be the stronghold for truth and economic freedom? If you ask me, which of course nobody does, I would not award the Memorial Prize to Javier Milei, but to Oskar Grau, who has been uncovering and denouncing Milei's fraud for already 2 years. By the way, all the links to his articles can be found in the video description. They are very worth reading. But I also don't want to put the entire Mises Institute of Germany in a bad light. Thorsten Polleit was invited to the Property and Freedom Society again this year by Hans-Hermann Hoppe, and Andreas Tietke has written by far the best book on praxeology since Human Action. At least this is something the Americans can envy us Germans. I would be happy to translate it to English if there are sponsors for this. My email and PayPal address are in the video description, by the way. The priorities in the libertarian camp seem to be different at the moment. Obviously, most people want to take advantage of Milei's media coverage to convert people interested in politics to their camp, even if this raises the question which camp that should be if the chainsaw noises are followed by only half-hearted actions. And I can also understand that many American libertarians with a large following, such as Dave Smith, currently prefer to deal with foreign policy in relation to Ukraine and Russia, as well as Israel and Gaza. But also, in terms of foreign policy, Javier Milei does not represent any libertarian positions. Milei governs together with the conservatives, and so often people with a greater inclination to political strategy instead of a libertarian worldview also want to explain to you that as a democratically elected president, you cannot just act and rule however you want, but you have to make compromises. So Milei's policy is more neoconservative than anti-interventionist. The libertarian positions, as expressed by Ron Paul again, should be understood by literally everyone. End the Fed and no more foreign wars. This isn't rocket science. However, Milei has expressed active support for American imperialist foreign policy. He has bought aircrafts from the US. He has donated money to Zelensky. He wants to see the Argentinian citizen in uniform respected again. He wants to expand the war against drugs. He wanted to join NATO and is associated with the Chabad Lubavitch movement, which, broadly speaking, advocates a greater Israel. Philip Bargos comments on this in a rather contradictory manner. He says that Argentina is insignificant in terms of foreign policy, and that Milei's foreign policy merely serves to cooperate with the conservatives, without whom the government would collapse. But if Argentina is meaningless in a foreign policy, a non-interventionist foreign policy without the waste of taxpayers' money would obviously be the better solution. It is quite possible that Javier Milei did all this just to make himself look good in the eyes of the US and Donald Trump. But the mood among the American population is increasingly shifting away from supporting Israel, because the majority simply do not see why their tax money should be spent on never-ending wars. And this is really something that anyone who calls themselves a libertarian or even an anarcho-capitalist in the Rothbardian tradition could have easily foreseen.
You have this anti-system movement. What we are seeing is a revolution against the system. So fixing the present system is not enough. Now there is, of course, an anti-system which is called libertarianism, which means to tear down everything which creates some kind of influence of government into private lives.
If I were a follower of Klaus Schwab's globalist one world government vision, I would do pretty much the same as Javier Milei is doing right now. More and more people are losing faith in the state. There is an anti-statist movement called libertarianism that more and more people are running towards. So I just hand over some of the power of the state into supposedly libertarian hands. And then, when the libertarian government has failed, I point at them and say, see, libertarianism doesn't work. That's what we've been telling you all along. The genius of this move is that you don't have to deal with the already convinced anarcho-capitalists in the first place. They are not the target group. The target group are the willing voters and Democrats who always say things like, well, after all, he says the right things. It is better if a libertarian is in the government than a leftist. Better if he gets 60% libertarian policy implemented than 0%, isn't it? But faced with this logic, I think it is better to understand libertarianism as some kind like the abolition movement. There is no compromise that each person is the unique ruler of his own body, and a political solution to this problem does not exist in the form of a democratic voting. In 1860, no one could have imagined that slavery would be over in a few years. In 1980, no one could have imagined that the Soviet Union would collapse. In 2019, no one could have imagined having to wear a mask when they entered the supermarket. Even really dark situations can change abruptly, but to do so, the general opinion, the power of the better ideas, must be right. This involves little more than explaining that mere theory, the pure doctrine, is not the fantasy of an eccentric academic that should not be given too much weight in practice, but rather is the basis for action. The repudiation of all public debt is the appropriate procedure for a central bank before its abolition. Non-intervention, or peace, is the basis for a prosperous society, and political power should be as decentralized as possible. Javier Milei does not practice what he preaches, but as long as people believe he does, because too few speak out against it, and libertarian-leaning individuals tend to only see Philip Bagos in interviews, who supports Milei's betrayal of libertarianism, they will turn back to more authoritarian rulers, which certainly helps no one. So anyway, just a gentle reminder. Taxation is theft, end the Fed, no more foreign wars, become ungovernable.